Ron, can you tell us kind of what was the last thing we talked about in part one of the Civil War? Where did we gain some victories? Which theater? Western theater. We had victories at Memphis, Tennessee. We had victories at New Orleans. We are going to later get a victory at Vicksburg. They're going to hold out till the very end. So what we're going to do on the Civil War in the United States Part 2 is we're going to shift from the Western theater, which is land west of the Appalachian Mountains, to the Eastern theater, which are lands to the east of the Appalachian Mountains. Now, who has Lincoln given overall command to? Who's the overall commander of Union forces? No, he's just a grunt general right now. Winfield Scott. And this is going to be the first of several changes. Lincoln just is having a hard time finding a good overall commander. So after this part of the Civil War, especially after the first Battle of Bull Run, President Lincoln replaced General Winfield Scott and gave overall command of the Union Army to General George McClellan. General George McClellan. So again, after the first Battle of Bull Run, President Lincoln's going to change overall commanders for the first time, first of many times, and he's going to replace General Winfield Scott with Union General George McClellan. Now, McClellan came up with a new three-part strategy for the Union concerning the Civil War. And this is all going to amount in the Eastern Theater. What was one of the biggest problems with the Union troops at the first Battle of Bull Run? What are some problems they have? Well, we'll use that. A little confusing on the uniforms because they are going to make changes because of that. So that was one issue the Union had, but also the South had that too. But what are some problems the Union had, do you think? First of all, they were very overconfident, right? Secondly, a lot of these guys were at the end of their 90-day enlistment, so they probably, in general, are not very well what? Trained. Very good. So the first of the three-part strategy for the Union that was put together by General McClellan is he realized that he needed to build up that Union Army with better preparation and training. Those soldiers that went into the first Battle of Bull Run were not very well trained nor prepared for what they got themselves involved in. So he made the decision that my first part of my strategy is to better prepare and better train these Union forces. The second part of his strategy is he wanted to approach the Confederate capital, which is located where? Richmond, from the north. And to do that, he's going to cross both the York and the James Rivers. And we'll talk about that later. So he wants to approach the Confederate capital from the north, from Washington, and he's going to cross both the York River and the James River to do so. And the third part of his strategy is once he better prepared and trained his soldiers, and once they approached the Confederate capital of Richmond from the north, crossing both the York and James Rivers, what's the third part of the strategy? What? Well, after that, what happens? But they're going to attack what? And they're going to win, so they're going to capture Richmond and end the Civil War. So this is what McClellan saw as the keys to victory. 1, better prepare and train our troops. 2, march from the north southward towards Richmond, Virginia, crossing both the York and James Rivers, engage Confederates at Richmond, capture Richmond, and end the Civil War. That's what he saw was the key to victory. And he wasn't that far off. It's just going to take a while to get there. Okay? Well, we're going to talk about several battles in the Eastern Theater, and the first one is going to be the Battle of Pharaoh. And it's going to be very important that you guys understand these battles, the commanders, and what the result was. In other words, who won. So the Battle of Pharaoh. Now, all of these battles that I'm going to be talking about are going to be battles that take place as Union forces do what? March towards Richmond. Okay? Now, the Battle of Pharaoh took place in April of 1862. April of 1862. And the Union Army was stationed at Fort Monroe, Virginia. April of 1862, and the Union Army was stationed at Fort Monroe, Virginia, which was about 70 miles from Richmond. So they're within 70 miles of Richmond, the Union Army, stationed at Fort Monroe, Virginia. Where are Confederate troops located, you think? Near where? Obviously, Richmond. So Confederate troops, which are stationed near Richmond, are badly, badly outnumbered. And the Confederates were waiting for General Joe Johnston to arrive in Richmond with Confederate reinforcements. So the rebels were waiting for Confederate General Joe Johnston to arrive in Richmond with Confederate reinforcements. So what are they going to have to do between now and the time that Johnston arrives with reinforcements? They're going to have to hide what? What are they going to have to hide from the Union? What? No, they're going to have to hide the fact that they are what? Outnumbered. So, to hide the fact that they were so outnumbered, Confederate General Joe Johnston ordered his soldiers to do the two following things. So to hide the fact that they are so vastly outnumbered, Confederate soldiers were ordered by General Joe Johnston, not by General Joe Johnston, excuse me. They were ordered by their commander to do the following until Joe Johnston arrived. What would be the way you could hide the fact you're outnumbered? What would they do? Because the Union's going to send out scouts. What would you do to hide the fact that you're outnumbered? Think back at kind of what Washington did. Remember some of the things he did? What's that? Make noise. Very good. They had their soldiers march back and forth loudly to make the Union Army believe there were many more soldiers near Richmond than there really were. So they marched continuously and loudly, which made the Union believe that there were more soldiers near Richmond than there really were. What else might intimidate the Union Army, not have them attack? And you kind of mentioned it when I said at first, you mentioned this when we talked about strategy. You talked about cannons? Yeah. Well, they didn't have a lot of cannons. But when these scouts came to see how many cannons they had, believe this or not, the Confederate got great big large logs and painted them black and set them up in formation, and from a distance they looked like cannons. So they painted large logs black and set them upright, making them look like cannons from a distance. And it worked for a period of time. Well, meanwhile, as the Confederates are looking sad and waiting for reinforcements, General McClellan, back at Fort Monroe, Virginia, he's slowly now advancing his troops towards Richmond, and he stops at White House Landing, Virginia. So McClellan and his troops leave Fort Monroe, Virginia, which was about 70 miles from Richmond, and they begin to march towards Richmond, and then they stop at White House Landing, Virginia. Why did they stop? Because McClellan and the Union are waiting for 55,000 reinforcements that General Irvin McDowell is bringing in. What does that do for the Confederates? What's that do for them? Puts them in worse shape than they were before, right? So McClellan and his troops are advancing slowly towards Richmond. They stop at White House Landing, Virginia. Why? Because they're waiting for 55,000 reinforcements to join them under the command of General Irvin McDowell. Remember, General McDowell was the Union leader during the first Battle of Bull Run. Now, what do you think the arrival of these Union reinforcements is going to do for the Confederates? It's going to be a disaster. So as a result, the Confederates are going to need to keep the Union reinforcements from reaching McClellan. So they're going to have to come up with a strategy to keep those 55,000 Union soldiers under the command of Irvin McDowell to ever get to White House Landing. Who are the Confederates going to call upon to keep these reinforcements from arriving to McClellan? Who's the most famous Confederate general we've talked about in your mind? Thomas Stonewall Jackson. So it will be General Thomas Stonewall Jackson who will be given the responsibility to keep these Union reinforcements from arriving to General McClellan at White House Landing. How are they going to do that? What are they going to have to do to keep from getting there? If you're going to keep Tom Brady from winning the Super Bowl on a touchdown pass, what are you going to have to do? You're going to have to get between Tom Brady and Marcellus Bennett, who's going to catch the ball, and if you're lucky, you might intercept the pass. Well, that's what General Thomas Stonewall Jackson needed to do. He needed to intercept General Irvin McDowell and those 55,000 soldiers before they got to White House Landing and joined with McClellan's forces. How's he going to do that? He's going to have to engage those 55,000 men in battle and hopefully defeat them so that they will not go to White House Landing. And that's exactly what Jackson does. With just 18,000 men, Jackson intercepts McDowell and his 55,000 Union soldiers. He intercepts them before he gets to White House Landing. And General Jackson and his rebel army won a series of battles against Irvin McDowell in the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia. So, Confederate General Stonewall Jackson will be called upon to keep the reinforcements from arriving to General McClellan, and with a force of nearly 18,000 rebels, Jackson intercepts Union General McDowell and his 55,000 soldiers, and they fight furiously in the Shenandoah Valley, and General Jackson and his rebel army win and prevent those Union reinforcements from getting to McClellan. Not only did it keep those reinforcements from getting to McClellan, what happened to the Confederate forces stationed outside of Richmond? They received their what? Reinforcements from Joe Johnston. So, not only did this brave action by General Jackson and his men prevent the Union reinforcements from arriving to White House Landing, it also gave the Confederate reinforcements under Joe Johnston time to arrive in Richmond. Well, when these new soldiers reached the Confederate camp, they engaged General McClellan and his troops, who were marching from White House Landing. That battle became known in Civil War history as Battle of Pharaoh. Okay? So, with these new soldiers, the Confederates engaged the Union Army under McClellan just outside of Richmond in a battle known as the Battle of Pharaoh. Now, the Union fails to defeat the Confederates. Do the Confederates overwhelm McClellan and his forces at Fair Oaks? No. All they really need to do is fight to a standstill so that there's no advancement upon Richmond, right? But here's where the Union screws up. And this is the second tactical mistake of the war. Think about what we talked about. What could the Union have done to maybe overrun the Confederates and take the capital of Richmond and end the war? Where'd they screw up in this lecture so far? McClellan did what? He waited. He had plenty of men that if he would have marched from White House Landing down to Richmond, how you doing?
I'm just listening.
Oh, if he would have marched down to Richmond and not waited for those 55,000 reinforcements that were coming from McDowell, historians say that he could have overrun the undermanned rebel forces there and possibly ended the war in favor of the Union. So instead he waited for those reinforcements, which was the second tactical mistake of the Civil War, this time on the northern side.
He was so scared of body count.
He was not like Grant, was he?
No, Grant is not afraid to let people die.
Yeah. And Mr. Dorn makes a good point. McClellan was much more cautious than Grant on casualties. And so a lot of these Union generals are too cautious. And this is why Lincoln is going to change overall commanders several times until he gets to who to lead them. Grant. Very good. Okay. So you have your second tactical mistake of the Civil War, this part, by the Union. Now take into consideration, kiddos, that during all this time we've talked, what side is Robert E. Lee on? He's still on the Union side. He still hasn't made a decision. And that takes us to our next subtopic, which is Robert E. Lee's tough decision. How many people do you think thinks Robert E. Lee fought on the Confederate side from the first fall of Fort Sumter? Most people do, okay? Well, during this Battle of Pharaoh, Confederate General Joe Johnston was wounded and would need to be replaced, okay? And the man the South wanted to replace Joe Johnston was Robert E. Lee. So during the Battle of Pharaoh, Confederate General Joe Johnston was wounded. He would need to be replaced. And the man that the South wanted to replace him was Robert E. Lee. Well, gee whiz, he's a Union commander. But where's he from? Virginia. Okay, he's from Virginia. So Lee's going to be faced with a very difficult decision. Now, going back to the Confederate attack on Fort Sumter, which started this whole thing, as we mentioned, Robert E. Lee was an officer of the Union Army. And at the time of Fort Sumter, his home state of Virginia was leaning towards secession, right? Well, we're going to go back. In April of 1861, before any of this business started, Lee received a message from General Winfield Scott, who was the overall commander of Union forces. And this message that Lee received from General Scott, Scott asked Lee to visit him at Scott's home. So in April of 1861, Robert E. Lee receives a message from General Winfield Scott, who's the overall commander of Union forces, and this message asks Lee if he will meet the general at his home, at Scott's home. Now they were good friends because Lee had fought under Scott in what skirmish prior to the Civil War? What war? The Mexican War. So Lee knew Winfield Scott. They were good friends. Lee fought under Scott's command during the Mexican War. Well, Lee arrived at Scott's home, and General Scott offered Lee the following during their meeting. Anybody want to remember what Lee's rank was when he was fighting off John Brown at Harper's Ferry? What was his rank? Colonel. He was just a colonel. So what's the first thing that Winfield Scott offered Robert E. Lee? Promotion from colonel to that of general. Okay? He would promote him from the rank of colonel to that of general. What else did he offer him? Winfield Scott offered that he didn't want anymore. What did Winfield Scott offer Robert Lee that he did not want anymore? What did Winfield Scott have at the time? Overall command of the Union Army, right? So he not only offered to promote him from colonel to general, he also offered him overall command of the Union Army during the Civil War. Who is this offer really coming from then? Although Scott gave it. Came from President Abraham Lincoln. Okay? So although Scott was giving him the offer, it officially was coming from the President of the United States, Abraham Lincoln. Well, Lee is not sure what his native state of Virginia is going to do because they have threatened secession, but they have not seceded. So because he's not sure of what Virginia is going to do, he turns down General Scott's offer. Is he still a Union soldier when he turns down the offer? He sure is. When does Lee resign from the United States Army after serving for 30 years. When does he resign? Come on. When does Lee decide to resign? When Virginia secedes from the Union. So when Virginia seceded from the Union, Lee then resigned from the United States Army after serving 30 years. Well, after he resigned from the United States Army, what did Lee do? Got on his horse Traveler and rode to Richmond, and he volunteered to do what? Serve the Confederate States of America. Okay? So as soon as Virginia seceded from the Union, Lee got on his horse Traveler, rode to Richmond, and volunteered to serve the Confederate States of America. Who's the president of the South at the time? Anybody remember? Jefferson Davis. And what does Jefferson Davis do? As soon as Robert E. Lee says, I'll volunteer to serve the Confederate States of America, he does the same thing that President Lincoln offered. He promotes him to general and gives him overall command of what? Confederate forces. So as soon as Lee arrives in Richmond and volunteers to serve the Confederate States of America, Confederate President Jefferson Davis promotes Lee to the rank of general and gives him overall command of Confederate forces in the Civil War. What do you think General Scott's reaction was when he learned about that? What was his reaction? What do you think? Do you think he might be mad or angry? Might think that Robert E. Lee's a traitor? He simply reacted by saying this: the United States has lost the very best officer in the service.